when royals, they're very naive in lots of ways. You see Andrew with his TV interview thinking, I'm Prince Andrew, I'm Prince, I can control the media. I'm very intelligent. I'll make the interview go the way I wanted it to go.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on the book. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
What made you want to write this book?
Well, actually, my interest in the royals goes back to the end of the 1980s. But I worked on a very eccentric magazine. We wrote about horses and fishing and that kind of thing. And our office looked into the grounds of Windsor Castle. And I became friends with the Queen's gamekeeper. And we were chatting one day, and by the way, his wife looked after the corgis. So he was deeply involved with the royal family. And anyway, I was chatting to him and he said, oh, no one's ever written a book about royal gillies, because at Balmoral and Sandringham, they employ gillies. You know, it's the old Gallic word for a servant, a Highland servant. So I did this book, and then it just developed from that. And I suddenly realized in more recent times that there's something very odd about royal scandals. First of all, they've always existed. You know, for centuries, royals, especially when the royal family lost political power, they became much more concerned, a bit like rock stars. You know, they could get anyone to sleep with them. They could, they could use personal power to get what they wanted. And I began to think, well, scandals, they're a bad thing for the royal family, but when you look more deeply, you realize actually they're both a good thing and a bad thing, because as someone said to me, someone very close to Diana said, the work for the royals, the one thing worse than being written about in a negative way because there's been a scandal is being completely ignored. Mm-hmm. So it was all that was behind the idea of the book. I just thought it would be so interesting.
So interesting. And I love how you kind of delve into how the press really does play a role into the royal scandals and things like that, and how the royals and the press kind of go hand in hand. But in your opinion, what are like the top 3 royal scandals of all time?
Well, I tend to go for I think of them as the more amusing ones. Something I found out about Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson, which I loved, was that, and it caused huge scandal within the royal family, although at the time it was never mentioned in the newspapers, but it was discovered that one of the reasons that Edward VIII fell in love with Mrs. Simpson was that she never treated him with any deference. She scolded him as if he was a naughty schoolboy. And to make matters worse, she used to do this thing in front of other people. I interviewed a servant who worked at their house in Windsor and actually saw this happening. She would say to Edward VIII, who was Prince of Wales at the time, before he became king, she would say, David, I need to have my toenails painted. And the king would the Prince of Wales would get down and paint her toenails. And apparently he loved this. But in royal circles, this was considered absolutely outrageous. I mean, it was considered the most terrible thing. My other favorite scandal, and this has only come out fairly recently, is, Queen Victoria, for 50 years after Prince Albert died, her husband, she gave the impression to the whole of the country and the whole of the world, she wore black every day for the next 50 years till she died. She gave the impression that Prince Albert was almost like a god, and that no one could ever replace him. But guess what? Secretly, she secretly married her gilly, John Brown, up at Balmoral. And I mean, I can say that with a degree of certainty, because the minister of the church who conducted the marriage, it was probably quite a perfunctory, because obviously she couldn't invite people, it was done in secret. But on his deathbed, a chap called Norman MacLeod, on his deathbed, he confessed that he'd married them. Now, no minister of the church would say something on his deathbed if it wasn't true.
That's true.
So I thought that's an extraordinary scandal. And my last, but not least favorite scandal concerns, he was the 9th child and the 6th son of George III. he's not very well known, but he lived in an enormous chunk of Kensington Palace. He was never going to become king because George III had so many sons. But he spent an absolute fortune of taxpayers' money collecting very rare Bibles. He had more than 1,000 of these very rare Bibles, and he was an atheist. And then having spent all this money, they'd never get away with that now, because the newspapers would say this is taxpayers' money being wasted. But he sort of, when he died, even then he did something which absolutely scandalized the royal family. He insisted that rather than be buried in the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, Windsor, where he should have been buried, he had himself buried in the local cemetery where lots of common people were buried. So I think those three, I just love that, they're entertaining and interesting for completely different reasons, but they would be my top three. Definitely.
I love those. Those are good, some good picks. But there's, like you said, there's been so many different types of scandals over the years. Which one would you say that probably rocked the royal family the most?
Oh, I think without question, it was the treatment of Diana, Princess Diana, and I think that was because they made a major misjudgment of just how popular she was, and I think that's because they felt she was a loose cannon. And to some extent, in the run-up to her dying, because they'd cut themselves off from her to some extent, because really they felt in the same way that in the early 20th century, in the 18th century and the 19th century, if a prince had affairs, his wife was expected just to put up with it. And Diana wasn't prepared to play that game. And so they felt she was the cause of all the trouble. So they distanced themselves from her. And by the time she died, they were out of touch with the extent to which she'd become this sort of world figure. And so that misjudgment, I think, nearly cost them the future of the crown. I mean, you probably remember, most people remember that in order to try and do something to repair the damage, when they realized how serious this was, the immediate members of the family, the senior members, actually stood on the pavement outside Buckingham Palace as the funeral cortege went past, and that was their way of signalling that they'd got it wrong, they'd misjudged it, and they knew they were in, they could have been in real trouble. And I think always the royal family's main concern is to keep it going. No king or queen wants to be the one who was on the throne when the whole thing collapsed. So it's about survival, really.
Right. Would you say that that's probably the biggest scandal that Queen Elizabeth has been in? Because like you're right, she has the motto never complain, never explain, so she's kind of slid under the radar when it comes to royal scandals a little bit. But would you say that that's probably the biggest one that she was involved in?
I think so, because it involved her son and the heir to the throne. And I think she was absolutely horrified, particularly because, as you just said, her main way of dealing with the press and bad publicity for herself had always been never complain and never explain. And it's worked absolutely brilliantly for her. And there she saw her son, the heir to the throne, trying to manipulate the press by giving an interview on television. His wife, eventually his former wife, also giving interviews on television. And I think she was shrewd enough to realize that whenever you try and manipulate the press, there's a danger that it will blow up in your face. Right. It's a dangerous, it's like playing with fire. And I think she thought Charles and Diana should never have done that. And we've seen, when royals, they're very naive in lots of ways. You see Andrew with his TV interview thinking, I'm Prince Andrew, I'm Prince, I can control the media, I'm very intelligent, I'll make the interview go the way I wanted it to go. And so I think it shows that her policy is easily the best one. Someone famously once said, if you're libeled on Monday in a newspaper and you make a big fuss, the story gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But if you just ignore it, at the end of the week, it's forgotten. And I think, so Queen Elizabeth has been very shrewd. And I think she was furious at the scandal that erupted when her son and her daughter-in-law just didn't do as she'd shown them you should do. And whereas William and Kate, I think, are much more inclined to adopt her policy.